Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Oklahoma. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1912. The spring rains had just passed over the prairie, leaving the dirt roads of Osage County slick with clay and silence. Telegraph poles leaned slightly eastward, as if the wind had taught them to bow. Few travelers came through those parts then, only the mailman, the undertaker's cart, and a widowed woman named Eleanor Price, who moved into the abandoned Whitcomb farmhouse 2 miles east of Fairfax. Locals said Eleanor was polite, but distant. She wore black even in summer, and carried herself like a person forever listening for something unseen. A month after her arrival, a man joined her, Mr. Edwin Price, who she claimed was her late husband's cousin. He looked pale and uncomfortable in daylight, always with gloves on, even in heat. They were seldom seen apart, and when they were, the neighbors remembered how still the house seemed, as if holding its breath. Old county papers later described the Whitcomb property as cursed. Its well had collapsed, its barn burned in 1907, and a previous tenant, a Mr. Amos Tully, had vanished without record. Sheriff McAllen had investigated back then, but only found disturbed earth behind the orchard. That phrase appeared again 5 years later, in the notes tied to the Price's case. In the early weeks of their stay, small things unsettled the nearby families. Dogs refused to approach the fence line. At night, a dim orange light could be seen flickering behind the upper windows, though no lamp burned when daylight came. The mailman, Mr. Crowder, testified that Eleanor received letters weekly, sealed in thick paper, Whitcomb, with a return address from Kansas City, Missouri, but she never sent replies. By July, whispers began to spread that the couple rarely visited town and that Edwin was seen digging near the orchard in the dark. When the butcher's boy passed by one evening, he claimed he heard a woman's voice crying softly, not from fear, but as though reciting something to herself. Reverend Joel Patterson from the local parish paid them a visit that August, carrying food from the church. He later wrote in his journal, "They appeared cordial, but the house smelled faintly of linseed and something copper-like." On a desk by the window sat 3 sealed envelopes addressed in the same hand. The handwriting was neat, too neat, and when I asked about them, Mrs. Price smiled and said, "Letters to the earth." The Reverend left before dusk. He never returned. In 1913, a year after their arrival, the Prices stopped attending services entirely. The orchard, once barren, now flourished strangely. Peaches out of season, bees absent. By autumn, the townsfolk had grown uneasy enough that Sheriff McAllen once again made the ride to the Whitcomb place. What he found, and what he chose not to write in his official report, would later become the foundation of the Oklahoma correspondence files kept briefly in the county archive before a mysterious fire in 1924 destroyed most of them. When Sheriff McAllen approached the Whitcomb property in late October 1913, the sky was the color of tarnished silver. He dismounted half a mile away, preferring to walk the rest, saying later in his notes that the place listened too well. The air carried the faint scent of iron. The front gate was chained, though no one remembered it ever being locked before. Through the orchard, he could see Edwin Price bent low near a mound of earth, his hands moving slowly with what appeared to be a trowel. Eleanor stood by the porch, watching, her expression unreadable. McAllen called out once, twice. Neither answered. When he reached the steps, Eleanor smiled faintly and said, "You're just in time. He's nearly finished." Inside the house, things felt arranged, but unlived in. 2 chairs, 1 mirror, no food in the kitchen except a row of glass jars sealed with wax. The sheriff noted a heavy odor of herbs and something sweet, like spoiled fruit. On a writing desk lay several letters, folded and tied with string, each marked with a red wax seal showing a small heart pressed into the stamp. The handwriting matched those from the Kansas City address the mailman described. McAllen pocketed one, intending to open it later. As he turned to leave, He noticed an odd stain on the parlor floor, wide as a rug, darker at the edges. He touched it with his boot, and it left a faint smear, still damp. The Prices did not protest when he asked them to visit the town office the next morning. But they never arrived. The following day, the sheriff returned with a deputy and a local doctor named Samuel Brigham. The house was locked from the inside. They forced the back door. The jars in the kitchen were gone. The letters on the desk had vanished, save for one fragment burned to ash. Upstairs, in a room under the eaves, the men found a cot covered in soil. On the floor beside it was a woman's glove, pressed flat as if by long weight. McCallan later wrote, "I could not tell if the bed was meant for rest or for keeping." Behind the orchard, the mound Edwin had tended was uncovered. Beneath it, they discovered wooden boards laid in a neat rectangle. Inside were bones. 2 sets at first glance, one clearly older. The remains had been cleaned and arranged, the hands of one set folded across the other's chest. The doctor estimated the first skeleton had been in the ground perhaps 5 years, the second less than 2. "He dug her up," Brigham said quietly, "and he buried himself beside her." The sheriff sealed the site and ordered a wagon for transport to the courthouse in Pawhuska. That night, a windstorm tore through the county, scattering branches and debris. By dawn, the bodies were missing. Only the boards remained, nailed shut, dirt undisturbed. The next morning, a letter arrived at the post office with no return name, only a Kansas City postmark. It read, "All debts settled. She sleeps as promised." The Osage County Register, in its brief column that winter, mentioned the incident once. Then, without reason, it stopped covering the matter. Over time, the Whitcomb property was reclaimed by weeds, and those who passed near it swore they could hear a woman's voice counting softly among the trees, stopping always at 3. The files, sealed and stamped in the 1914 ledger, were labeled simply, "The Correspondence Case." By the spring of 1914, the Whitcomb farmhouse stood deserted. Ivy had begun to crawl across the windows, and the orchard was nearly gone to rot. Sheriff McCallan, having failed to locate the Prices, filed his final report and retired the same year. But before leaving office, he met with Reverend Patterson's successor, a quiet man named Milton Kersey, who had come across something odd in the church archives. Inside an old wooden donation box, beneath layers of hymn sheets, Kersey found a folded map and 3 damp letters bearing Eleanor Price's handwriting. Each was dated between March and May 1913, the final one marked with a black smudge shaped like a thumbprint. The first letter spoke of restoring a vow interrupted by time. The second described a body not at peace, but waiting for his return. The last one ended with the line, "He hears me when the soil breathes." These were handed to the county office, but never officially catalogued. Kersey's own diary later noted that the paper smelled faintly of formalin, the same chemical the local undertaker used for preserving specimens. He wondered if the letters were ever truly meant to be mailed. That summer, a drifter passing through Fairfax claimed he'd seen a man and woman fitting the Price's description boarding a freight train bound north. The account came from an old rail worker named Amos Dodd, who remembered them because the woman carried a small box wrapped in linen, like something precious or dead. The conductor's log from that evening confirmed 2 passengers using the names Mr. and Mrs. Eaton. They purchased tickets only as far as Independence, Kansas. From there, all trace ended. In 1915, a family named Whitaker bought the property. Their eldest son, Henry, wrote years later that he'd often found small pits dug behind the orchard, shallow and filled with stones shaped like hearts. His mother forbade him fraud. Mentioning it, he recalled once, while tending the well, hearing the low murmur of 2 voices, as if rehearsing a prayer. In 1916, the Whitakers' youngest daughter, Lila, fell ill after drinking from the well. The doctor could not name the cause, though he noted a metallic taste in the water. The family left soon after. The house stood empty again. During a drought in 1918, a brush fire swept through the lower fields. When the flames subsided, townspeople reported seeing letters of soot across the side of the barn. the faint outline of the word debt. That detail appeared briefly in the Pawhuska Courier, which also mentioned the sheriff's lost file, an envelope stamped 1912 Correspondence. No one ever found it. A decade later, historian Mary Bell Quinn included a short section on the incident in her pamphlet, Strange Affairs of the Osage Frontier. She cited old rumors linking the Price's disappearance to the unrest around Osage County, Oklahoma, noting that oil speculation had drawn strangers and deceit alike to the plains. Yet her account ended abruptly with the remark, "The correspondence was said to have continued long after the writers were gone." Decades later, her notes too vanished from the library archives. Those who read them swore she'd hinted at something unearthed in a sealed chest beneath the church floorboards, something the Reverend chose never to open. In the winter of 1920, when the snow came early and the oil camps hummed with distant machinery, an aging clerk named Ruth Devlin was tasked with cataloging abandoned case files from the Pawhuska courthouse basement. Among the brittle papers, she found a thin ledger wrapped in wax cloth, marked only with the letters CLP in fading ink. Inside were entries written in two hands, the first believed to be Sheriff McAllen's, the second unfamiliar and curiously delicate. McAllen's final notation read, "Correspondence ongoing, recipients unknown." The later handwriting appeared beneath it, a simple line repeating the words soil and silence. Ruth, shaken, stored the ledger in her drawer overnight, but by morning it had disappeared. That same week, she resigned from her position, claiming she'd begun hearing a rhythmic knocking from beneath the courthouse floor. Her replacement dismissed it as pipes, yet one janitor later testified that he found faint indentations near the stairwell resembling small fingernail marks. Around that time, a Kansas City newspaper reported a body discovered in an unused freight car outside Independence. The corpse, male, was dressed in outdated formal wear, and in his coat pocket was a folded letter addressed to EP in an elegant hand. The ink had bled through, but one line remained legible. "The earth returns what it cannot keep." Authorities buried the body in a pauper's plot, though one rail worker insisted the deceased had been seen boarding trains years earlier with a veiled woman. No such woman was ever found. Locals began to refer to the figure as the man from Oklahoma. In 1922, Professor Alcott Merrill of the Tulsa Institute of Medicine wrote a small article linking the mysterious correspondence to practices of early 20th century spiritualism. He suggested the letters might have been part of a ritual known as the Earth Commas Union, wherein lovers attempted to communicate through burial and reinterment. Merrill cited Osage County, Oklahoma as one of several regions where such traditions mixed with folklore brought by European settlers. His piece was never reprinted. The Institute later distanced itself from the study. Still, copies circulated quietly among amateur historians and occult enthusiasts. That same year, a traveling photographer named Wallace Heaton took a picture near the ruins of the Whitcomb orchard. When developed, the plate showed two faint silhouettes by the old well, though Heaton swore he'd been alone. He sold the image once to a collector from Wichita and refused to speak of it again. By 1923, the farmhouse had collapsed entirely, leaving only the foundation and a single upright chimney. A local boy scavenging the site found shards of porcelain and the rusted frame of a hand mirror etched with initials EP. The boy's mother, fearing bad luck, threw the items into the river. Weeks later, she claimed to have received a letter addressed to her late husband, written in unfamiliar handwriting, but postmarked from Pawhuska. It read, "The orchard blooms again." When she took it to the post office, the clerk insisted no such delivery had been made. The envelope was blank when she opened it again. By 1924, fire consumed part of the county archive where McAllen's papers were stored, erasing the last official trace of the Prices. Only oral recollections remained, fragments spoken softly in farmhouses and recorded decades later by those who no longer believed them. Yet one line persisted through every telling. He stayed for her, even in the ground. By the summer of 1925, the Whitcomb property was little more than overgrown pasture. A surveyor named Charles Benton was hired by the county to mark new boundaries after the oil company purchased surrounding acreage. Benton's notes, later recovered from his nephew's attic, described finding remnants of brick paths leading nowhere and a faint hollow beneath the orchard soil that echoed when struck with a boot heel. He ordered a small team to excavate the area, expecting a well or cistern, but instead uncovered a sealed wooden crate packed with paper, hundreds of letters, each bound by twine and preserved in layers of wax. The writing was identical to that on the recovered fragments from the church archives. The topmost sheet began, "To those who keep their promises under the soil, I write again." Benton delivered the crate to the county office, where it was stored in the same vault as tax records. Within a month, the vault suffered water damage from a burst pipe, and every document inside turned to pulp except the sealed crate. Its contents remained dry, though the ink faded to a pale rust color. No one could explain why. When the letters were finally examined, they appeared to alternate between two voices, one pleading, one instructive. The male hand spoke of binding her to the orchard by vow, while the female hand mentioned a trait of breath for memory. Most disturbing were entries signed only with initials EP, followed by EP again, but written in different pen strokes, as if the same person signed twice for both sides of the exchange. Dr. Samuel Brigham, now retired and nearly blind, was called in to verify if the handwriting matched Eleanor's known letters. He confirmed the similarity, adding that either she wrote both parts or learned another's hand too well. Benton himself disappeared 2 weeks later while returning from Pawhuska to Tulsa. His wagon was found near a dry creek bed, overturned. Inside lay one wax-sealed envelope bearing his name. It contained a single sentence: "Your work was kind." The next month, a ranch hand claimed to have seen lantern light flickering near the ruins at dusk, followed by faint singing, like a woman's voice teaching a child to hum. Reporters from the Tulsa World arrived, publishing a brief piece titled "The Lover's Field Mystery." They cited the old case and referenced the burned files, but the editor withdrew the article after complaints from local officials. No copy survives today, though a typesetter later recalled the headline plate breaking clean in half after printing. Around that same year, a visiting ethnographer from St. Louis, Harold Klein, mentioned the story in his field journal, connecting it again to Osage County, Oklahoma folklore. He wrote of a recurring legend about the correspondence of the dead, a ritual wherein letters were buried to carry words across the grave. Klein claimed one of his local informants described the Prices exactly, including Eleanor's dark gloves and Edwin's pale complexion, though none had ever met them personally. "They still write," the informant told him. "The orchard keeps their ink." Klein's notebook ended abruptly on that page, the remaining sheets torn away. His belongings were later shipped back east, missing several entries. In 1927, a teacher named Florence Hale arrived in Fairfax to document local histories for the State Preservation Board. She was meticulous, practical, and by all accounts, unshakable. When she asked residents about the Whitcomb land, most shrugged it off as an old ghost story. But one elderly man, Tobias Reed, agreed to speak privately. His account, later found in Hale's field journal, was brief but unsettling. "There was a night," he said, "when the ground behind that orchard glowed faint, as if lanterns burned below it. Not fire, not lightning, just a steady, low light. My father said to stay inside, because she was waiting for him again." Hale, intrigued, rode to the property herself the following week. She described the ruins as silent, with only a few upright stones marking where the foundation once stood. She noted small rectangular patches of darker earth near the well, freshly disturbed, though it hadn't rained in weeks. Inside what remained of the chimney, she found a sealed tin box wrapped in oilcloth. Within were several folded pages and a small photograph showing two people seated beside a table, both faces blurred by exposure. Written beneath in faint pencil was the date 1912. One of the pages bore Eleanor Price's signature and a half-legible phrase, "He returns by soil, not by name." Hale brought her discovery to the local justice office, but within days, both the photo and papers were misplaced. The clerk responsible claimed they had been transferred to Tulsa for evaluation, yet no record of that transfer was ever located. Hale continued her research, tracing land ownership through the Osage County, Oklahoma records. She uncovered that the property was briefly purchased in 1921 by an individual named Edward Price, an alias she suspected linked to Edwin Price. The deed was signed, witnessed, and then voided. 6 weeks later, the signature distinctly trem bling. Around this same time, Hale began receiving anonymous letters, no return address, always posted from small towns across the state. Each carried a single sentence written in a graceful hand. "You are repeating the vow." The tone grew increasingly personal, the final one reading, "He won't stay buried again." Disturbed, Hale confided in the local sheriff, who dismissed it as prank mail. Yet a week later, when she failed to appear for her scheduled report in Pawhuska, her boarding room was found empty. Her belongings were untouched, except for a single wax-sealed envelope on the desk, unmarked. Inside was a pressed peach blossom, dried, perfectly preserved, scentless. The sheriff closed the case as voluntary disappearance, though her horse was later found tethered near the ruins of the Whitcomb orchard. In 1928, a highway construction crew uncovered fragments of human bone while grading the road bordering that same property. The remains were female, approximate age 40. The coroner noted a healed break in the wrist consistent with old injury, an exact match to a detail listed in Eleanor Price's medical records from 1909. Officially, the bones were interred in the Fairfax Cemetery under the tag "Unknown Woman." Unofficially, several workers swore the remains were accompanied by the faint scent of linseed oil and a torn strip of black cloth, as if from a mourning dress. The site was filled, the road paved, and traffic soon erased the last trace of disturbed earth. By 1930, the oil boom had transformed much of the county, yet locals still avoided the land once known as the Whitcomb property. The orchard was gone, the soil flattened beneath layers of gravel and weeds. That year, a small roadside inn was built nearby to accommodate passing truckers. Its owner, Arthur Gibbons, kept a ledger of guests that would later prove central to the story's revival. In late August, a woman arrived alone, introducing herself as Mrs. Evans. Gibbons described her as quiet, gray-eyed, dressed like someone waiting for a train that would never come. She carried a single trunk and refused cleaning service. After 3 days, she vanished, leaving the room immaculate except for a faint circular stain on the floor and an opened envelope lying on the dresser. The letter inside was dated 1912 and began with the words, "Dearest Eleanor, I've found a way for us both." Gibbons turned the note over to authorities, but they dismissed it as coincidence, a relic someone misplaced. Later handwriting analysis suggested the signature, though partly smudged, matched that of Edwin Price. That same autumn, during renovations near the highway, workers unearthed another crate, this time filled with small glass bottles labeled in fading ink: night, soil, silence. The liquid within each had long evaporated, but residue left dark rings on the crate bottom. Alongside the bottles were brittle sheets of parchment covered in reverse handwriting, legible only in mirror reflection. The text repeated one line again and again: "Soil remembers breath." A Tulsa journalist, Martha Keene, published an article titled "The Letters That Wouldn't Die," recounting the earlier investigations, Hale's disappearance, and the newest discoveries. The piece stirred brief regional interest, reviving curiosity about Osage County, Oklahoma, and its enduring legends. However, the paper retracted the article within weeks, citing legal pressure from unidentified parties. Keene resigned soon after, telling colleagues she'd received a letter written entirely backward, ending with, "Thank you for listening." In 1932, during a record-breaking drought, a farmer named Lewis Drummond purchased the surrounding land for grazing. He and his sons cleared the remaining ruins, burning debris through the night. In his diary, Drummond later wrote of hearing a humming sound from the ground when the fire reached the old well. He described it as like wind trapped in wood or a woman's voice far away. The next morning, when he returned to douse the ashes, he found the fire still smoldering, though rain had fallen overnight. Embedded in the mud beside the well was a small metal locket. Inside lay 2 photographs, one of a man, the other of a woman, both faintly smiling, their eyes dark voids from overexposure. The back of the locket bore an engraving, EP 1912, promised. Drummond's wife convinced him to throw it into the river, fearing superstition, yet he admitted in later letters he kept it hidden under the floorboards. After his death in 1935, the locket was reportedly found again during the estate sale, still cold to the touch despite summer heat. The buyer, a collector from Wichita, recorded that within a month of acquiring it, each of his photographs began developing faint, ghostly smudges, pairs of dark eyes appearing behind every face. The locket's trail ends there. It was never seen publicly again. By 1936, the Price's legend had slipped into local folklore, spoken only in whispers among those old enough to remember the orchard. The county's younger residents treated it as superstition, a story to frighten children. But a historian from Oklahoma City named Dr. Warren Leland arrived that spring to compile oral histories of forgotten rural tragedies. His notebook, preserved in part by the state archives, contained pages labeled EP Case. He recorded interviews with aging witnesses, among them Ruth Devlin, the former courthouse clerk who once catalogued the missing ledger. Now frail and near blind, Ruth told him she still dreamt of letters moving under the ground like worms. She described a recurring vision of two figures standing beneath the orchard, exchanging envelopes made of light. When asked if she believed they were ghosts, she replied, "No, sir, just promises that never learned to rest." Dr. Leland later visited the remains of the property himself. Nothing of the farmhouse remained but scattered stones and a depression where the well had stood. In his notes, he wrote that the air around the site felt electrically charged, as though after lightning. He collected a handful of soil, storing it in a tin marked EP for later analysis. That same summer, he mailed a report to the state university describing patterns of faint handwriting that appeared on the inside of the tin whenever it was opened in darkness, lines resembling cursive script but dissolving within seconds. The letter was dismissed by the university board as a fabrication. 2 months later, Dr. Leland's home burned in a nighttime blaze, traced to an overturned lamp. His remains were recovered near his desk, hands still clutching the melted tin. On the charred wall above him, the fire had left a strange residue forming 2 overlapping initials, EP. In September of that year, a preacher from Matone, nearby town, claimed a woman entered his church during evening service, dressed entirely in black, asking if the dead could still be forgiven for keeping a vow too long. When he tried to approach, she vanished between the pews, leaving behind only a damp footprint on the wooden floor. The following morning, the preacher found an envelope nailed to the church door. It contained a photograph of the Whitcomb orchard in full bloom, impossible for that time of year. And on the back, a line written in neat cursive, "He has returned." The preacher turned the image over to the authorities, who dismissed it as a prank, yet his congregation dwindled soon after, many saying they felt watched during service. The county's remaining elders began referring to the land as the Correspondence Field. During a 1937 flood, part of the highway washed out near the site, revealing a layer of old planks beneath the soil, each marked with carved letters resembling names. The flood washed them away before they could be recovered. By then, only a few still remembered Osage County, Oklahoma's strange pair, and even fewer cared to repeat the story. Yet travelers occasionally reported seeing 2 silhouettes by the road at dusk, one taller, one slight, walking hand in hand toward the darkened orchard that no longer existed. Those who stopped said the figures always turned at the same moment, their faces hidden but their eyes reflecting faint light, as if catching the last trace of a lantern burning underground. By 1938, talk of the Correspondence Field had spread quietly beyond Oklahoma through letters exchanged between amateur folklorists and spiritualists fascinated by the case. One such figure, a Boston researcher named Eleanor Hart, began compiling reports about couples who claimed to dream of the Prices. Her surviving notes, now housed in a private collection, describe a pattern that disturbed even her rational mind. Those who wrote to her, often mentioned seeing a woman in morning dress holding a folded letter sealed with red wax, her lips moving as if whispering a name. A handful claimed that after such dreams they discovered damp soil near their windowsills or the faint scent of peaches. Hart corresponded briefly with a professor at the University of Tulsa who had heard of Dr. Leland's burned estate. He confirmed that the tin of soil had been recovered, though now entirely empty. Hart's last entry reads, "The earth writes back." That same year, a drought struck Osage County, Oklahoma, exposing older layers of farmland long buried beneath the shifting topsoil. Workers clearing a new ditch discovered remnants of what appeared to be stone markers arranged in a circle roughly 20 feet wide. Each bore a faint engraving, though erosion had erased most symbols. One, however, still held a readable inscription, "Promised in soil." The stones were reported to county officials, but quietly removed by an unknown party before they could be studied. The ditch was filled the next day. In October 1939, a long-haul truck driver named John Escher stopped at a gas station along the highway near Fairfax. He told the attendant he'd nearly run over two folks walking out of nowhere. He swore they'd been dressed in outdated clothing, like a picture from before the war, and moved in perfect unison until vanishing into the fog. When police questioned him later, Escher added that his truck radio had begun crackling moments before the sighting, carrying what sounded like a faint voice reading names from a list. He remembered only one clearly, Eleanor. The following week, another driver reported the same pair standing beside a fruit stand that hadn't been there hours earlier. No such stand existed when authorities arrived. These reports drew the attention of a local journalist named Julian Voss, who attempted to gather testimonies for a serialized feature. His article was to be titled, "Letters from the Ground." However, before publication, he was found unconscious in his office, the typewriter ribbon pulled completely out and arranged across his desk in the shape of two letters, EP. When he recovered, Voss claimed he had no memory of the event and burned all his notes, saying only, "They wanted the story told their way." During that same autumn, tremors were recorded in the region, small quakes lasting seconds but centered unnaturally near the old Whitcomb site. Geologists attributed it to settling ground, yet some locals insisted the noise beneath the earth sounded not like rock, but a slow dragging, as if something heavy was moving closer to the surface. Soon after, the orchard's location was paved entirely, disappearing beneath a new stretch of county road. But those who drive that route after dark sometimes claim their headlights dim for a moment, and in the silence that follows, they hear what resembles the faint tearing of paper beneath the wheels. By the start of 1940, the story of the Prices had grown into something between folklore and forbidden research. The county authorities discouraged any reference to the orchard, calling it a matter long closed. Still, some residents of Fairfax refused to drive that stretch of road at night. Among them was a widower named Harold Fitch, a retired telegraph operator who claimed to have once known Eleanor Price when she worked briefly in Kansas City as a typist. He told his niece, who later recorded his recollections, that Eleanor had been too calm for her own good. Fitch recalled her fascination with ink, how she'd test the consistency of every brand by writing the same word over and over, promise. In 1940, when he heard rumors of her reappearing near Osage County, he returned to see for himself. He spent 2 nights at the roadside inn built near the old orchard. On the second night he awoke to the sound of knocking against his window. Thinking it was wind, he ignored it until the knocks formed a rhythm. 3 slow, 2 quick, 3 slow again. When he finally looked, no one was outside, but the glass bore faint fingerprints from within, though his hands were clean. The next morning, he checked out and rode back to Kansas City, swearing never to speak of what he'd seen. Yet later that year, his niece received a parcel from him containing a single sheet of heavy stationery sealed with wax. Inside, it read in precise handwriting, "She's still writing. The ground keeps her letters safe." Fitch vanished 2 months later. His house was found locked from the inside, his typewriter still warm, a final unfinished page rolled into the carriage. To Eleanor, from your devoted Edwin. In that same period, a young geographer named Clara Dean began researching local seismic patterns for the State University. While mapping fault lines across Osage County, Oklahoma, she noted that recurring tremors often coincided with rainstorms, as though something beneath the ground responded to moisture. Reviewing land records, she discovered references to the long-vanished orchard and the missing correspondence files. Intrigued, she traveled to Fairfax and interviewed surviving residents. Most denied remembering the case, but one elderly shopkeeper whispered that, when the soil gets wet enough, you can hear them talk. Dean dismissed the superstition until one afternoon when she visited the old site alone with her measuring equipment. Her field notes describe hearing a faint tapping sound beneath the soft earth. Steady, deliberate, rhythmic, like someone gently rapping from below. The sound continued even as she moved away, fading only when she reached the road. That night, she stayed in town and developed her photographs from the survey. Every frame was blank except for one. A dark exposure showing the outline of two figures standing side by side where the orchard once grew. The following morning, she mailed her report to the university. It never arrived. Dean herself went missing 3 weeks later during a field trip to Tulsa. Her colleagues found only her notebook wedged beneath the seat of her automobile, open to a single page with one line written repeatedly. Ink cannot die. By the end of that year, a local minister publicly declared the old orchard unfit for consecrated ground. He urged parishioners never to disturb it again. The declaration was read once at Sunday service, then removed from the church records without explanation. In 1941, as war shadowed the headlines and the old frontier towns shifted toward silence, the Whitcomb story resurfaced one final time within official papers. A government surveyor named Milton Reeves, tasked with rerouting electrical lines across Osage County, Oklahoma, noted in his field log that the ground near the former orchard produced irregular magnetic readings. His instruments would flicker wildly, then return to normal once moved a few feet away. He described it as a pulse, not of metal, but of memory. Reeves contacted the State Engineering Bureau to request a deeper survey. Days later, his supervisor received an anonymous telegram advising against it. The message contained no sender's name, only 3 words: "Leave the vow buried." Reeves ignored the warning. On July 19th, while drilling near the site, his crew uncovered an iron box roughly the size of a ledger. Inside were several small envelopes sealed with red wax, their paper yellowed but intact. Each bore the same initials, EP. The writing within was faded yet legible, letters written in alternating tones of tenderness and command. "You must remain," one said. Another read, "I feel your breath through the roots." Reeves turned the box over to local authorities, who recorded its contents, then inexplicably returned it to him. He took it home to Tulsa, where he lived with his wife and daughter. 3 nights later, his wife reported hearing him speaking softly in his study long after midnight. When she entered, she found the room empty, but the chair still rocking and the box open upon the desk. Reeves was never seen again. His automobile was later discovered outside Fairfax, parked near the overgrown highway. In the passenger seat lay a sheet of paper with a single line: "Soil keeps its promises." By late autumn, the county clerk received a letter addressed in familiar handwriting, unsigned, bearing his same red seal. It read, "We are together now. Do not disturb us again." The envelope contained traces of reddish earth and a pressed peach petal, long dried. The clerk, unnerved, locked it in the evidence vault, where it remained until 1950, when floodwaters destroyed the building. No one could later confirm its fate. Around that same time, a traveling priest from Kansas, Father Callahan, passed through Osage and was told of the Price's legend. Against advice, he visited the orchard's remains, hoping to perform a final blessing. He later confessed to colleagues that he'd found no orchard, no ruins, only smooth ground covered in low weeds and the faint outline of 2 figures in the soil, side by side, arms crossed as though resting. He sprinkled the area with holy water, yet the droplets vanished before touching the earth. That night, staying in a boarding house near the town square, Callahan awoke to find his Bible open to a blank page where verses had once been printed. In its center was a faint handwritten phrase in ink, the color of rust. all vows fulfilled. The priest left town at dawn, refusing to speak of it again. By the year's end, the orchard's exact location had slipped from maps, erased during new zoning surveys. What remained was only a narrow stretch of road where, even decades later, engines would stall without reason. By the spring of 1942, Osage County had changed beyond recognition. Military convoys rolled through the plains, the hum of engines replacing the once quiet nights, yet locals swore that the stretch of highway passing over the old Whitcomb land still carried a heaviness unlike anywhere else. Travelers reported radios crackling into silence and headlights dimming when they reached the midpoint. The county dismissed it as faulty wiring, but an independent mechanic named Thomas Reeve took interest. He tested several cars, driving the route at dusk. Each time his gauges flickered precisely where the orchard had once stood. After his final run, he stopped at the roadside and stepped out to inspect the soil. He later wrote in his log, "Ground is cool, damp, and hollow beneath surface. Smells faintly of peaches." He returned the next morning with digging tools, but the site appeared freshly graded, no longer soft. When he pressed his hand to the earth, he felt a vibration like a faint heartbeat. That night, he dreamed of a woman in black gloves holding a letter that dissolved into dust before he could read it. Reeves' final entry, dated April 9th, reads, "There is someone beneath, listening." He vanished 2 days later, his truck abandoned on the same road. The ignition key was still in place, but the ground under the tires was damp, though it hadn't rained in weeks. That summer, the State Historical Society attempted to consolidate records of unverified cases for wartime archiving. Among the submissions was a folder labeled the Correspondence Case. Inside were copied testimonies, faded maps, and one surviving photograph of the Whitcomb orchard taken years before its collapse. In the image's lower corner, 2 faint silhouettes stood by the well. An archivist named Helen McCord, reviewing the materials, noted that the figure's shadows stretched opposite to the direction of Sioux and light. She contacted her supervisor, but when the photo was re-examined days later, the silhouettes were gone, leaving only the orchard. McCord resigned soon after, stating that she felt a persistent presence near the cabinet. Her replacement later discovered a sealed envelope addressed to her in the same drawer. It contained a page torn from an old hymnal, on which was written in careful script, "Thank you for seeing us." Around the same time, the regional post office reported a backlog of undeliverable letters, all addressed to names unlisted in any registry, but sharing identical handwriting. They originated from towns across Osage County, Oklahoma, each marked with dates that corresponded to the anniversaries of Eleanor Price's arrival and disappearance. Postal workers noted that the ink on many envelopes never fully dried. In 1943, during heavy rain, part of the highway subsided, revealing fragments of wood and a section of metal piping. Workmen sent to repair it claimed to hear knocking from below. One of them, a veteran named Reed Mallory, swore he heard a voice repeating 3 words, soft, rhythmic, and pleading, "Still waiting, still waiting." The crew filled the hole quickly and left the site unfinished. That winter, a maintenance foreman inspecting the repaired section found a letter trapped in the mud. It bore no address, only the phrase, "For those who remember." He kept it for years, unopened, and passed it to his grandson, who decades later would tell a television reporter, "It's better sealed. Some stories stay buried for a reason." In 1944, wartime rationing silenced much of the country's smaller towns. Yet Fairfax still whispered about the strange patch of road where engines faltered and headlights dimmed. The county had long ceased maintenance, letting the weeds overtake the ditches. But that summer, a convoy truck stalled there at dusk. Its driver, Corporal James Lanier, later filed a report stating that he had seen 2 individuals standing in the mist, neither moving, both pale as reflection. He described their faces as familiar in an impossible way. When officers revisited the site, they found only footprints pressed shallow into the mud, vanishing mid-stride. The prints were examined, but no tread pattern matched. Within the same month, a group of surveyors from Tulsa passed through the area while charting new telephone lines. One of them, a young engineer named George Halley, recorded in his field journal that the soil around the site contained traces of a faint organic dye resembling iron-based ink. He labeled the sample EP compound and sent it to the university for analysis. The lab report concluded it was unlike any natural substance, containing microscopic particles consistent with writing fluid but lacking pigment source. Halley, fascinated, returned several times to collect more samples. On his last visit, he took a photograph of the ground at twilight. When developed, faint lines of script appeared across the soil, curling into loops and cursive fragments like unfinished letters. He wrote in the margin, "It's writing itself again." Halley was killed in a vehicle accident the following winter. Among his belongings, investigators found an unopened envelope sealed with red wax and labeled "Return to Sender." Inside, there was nothing but a pinch of fine dust smelling faintly of linseed oil and decay. During this time, a widowed schoolteacher named Edith Merrow rented a small home near the site. She began keeping nightly journals about strange occurrences, soft tapping on the windows, the scent of peaches after rain, and faint murmuring from the ground when the wind died. One entry read, "They are polite, whoever they are. They just want to be heard." Edith wrote letters to the local paper describing what she heard, but none were ever published. In her final journal entry, dated December 6, 1944, she described dreaming of a man kneeling beside a grave, whispering to the earth as though dictating a letter. When he turned, she wrote, his eyes were hollow and bright, and his mouth moved without sound. Then she appeared behind him, smiling, holding a folded paper that looked wet. Edith vanished the next morning. Her bed was undisturbed, her lamp still lit, her journals gone. The sheriff noted no sign of struggle, though neighbors reported seeing a pale glow moving through the field that night. Within a week, soldiers stationed nearby refused to patrol the stretch after dark. They claimed the static on their radios would form voices reciting fragments of words, mostly names, sometimes the phrase, "The orchard blooms again." To this day, those recordings remain archived in an unmarked folder within the county's forgotten police files, the audio degraded but the rhythm unmistakable, slow, deliberate, and written in sound rather than ink. By 1945, the war's final year brought both noise and absence. Fairfax's roads filled with soldiers returning home, yet the stretch of land once known as the Whitcomb property remained untouched, its boundaries marked only by broken posts and a faint rise where the orchard had once grown. The townspeople avoided it still. That autumn, a veteran named Peter Hollis, recently discharged from the Pacific, purchased a small plot adjacent to the site to raise livestock. Hollis, known for his discipline and lack of superstition, laughed at the locals' warnings. He rebuilt a barn and plowed part of the old road to make pasture. The first night he stayed there, he heard what he described as the slow tearing of paper carried on the wind. He thought nothing of it until the next morning, when his plow struck something hard beneath the soil. Digging further, he uncovered a glass jar containing a folded letter sealed with wax, perfectly preserved despite decades underground. The paper inside read, "Do not return what was promised." Hollis kept the letter, but later that week his cattle refused to cross that section of ground. When he forced them, they bolted in panic. He sold the land within the month. The buyer, a farmer named Joel Atkinson, burned the remaining orchard stumps and found in the ashes a small metal tag engraved EP 1912. He brought it to the county office, but the clerk dismissed it as scrap. Atkinson later told neighbors that every night afterward, the same scent of linseed oil and peaches filled his house. He eventually boarded the windows and moved away. In December of that year, as snow covered the county, a series of letters arrived at post offices across Oklahoma, each addressed to long-deceased residents. The handwriting was identical to the correspondence once attributed to Eleanor Price. Postal authorities traced the dispatch to a rural drop box near Pawhuska. Inside, they found nothing but damp soil. Among the recipients was the Fairfax Town Hall, which received one envelope addressed simply to "Those Who Keep Records." Inside was a single slip of parchment on which had been written in faded ink, "Thank you for waiting." The town clerk placed it in the archives, where it later went missing. That same winter, a newspaper columnist researching forgotten American mysteries mentioned Osage County, Oklahoma, and the so-called corpse-loving pair. His article compared the story to other legends of letters written to the dead. Yet days before publication, the presses jammed repeatedly, each time producing smudges in the shape of cursive lines across the paper. The foreman recalled that the ink tray overflowed despite using half its normal supply. The editor scrapped the story. Within weeks, the columnist fell ill and began mumbling about a promise too deep for graves. He died before spring. The manuscript of his article was found years later, hidden inside a library volume, still damp where the ink had never fully dried. Its final line read, "They don't rest because they were never apart." By early 1946, the county records office began a post-war cleanup of long-abandoned files. Among the dust-covered boxes, an assistant clerk named Mary Talbot discovered a folder labeled EP, Closed Correspondence. Inside were only two items, a torn photograph of a man and woman standing before a peach tree, and a single folded note that read, "We were promised 50 years." The ink had bled into the fibers, but the number 50 was unmistakable. Talbot mentioned it casually to her supervisor, who told her to discard it. Instead, she kept the photograph, tucking it into her Bible. Within a week, she fell ill and refused to speak. Her final written words to her sister were, "The soil is counting years." She died before her 27th birthday. The phrase 50 years gained quiet attention among local historians who remembered the original 1912 case. A few wondered whether the strange disturbances, the letters and the sightings, had always followed a fixed cycle, something destined to close in 1962, precisely 50 years from the Price's first arrival. That spring, university students conducting regional folklore surveys revisited Osage County, Oklahoma, to gather stories from the surviving generation. One, a graduate named Robert Innes, compiled testimonies that referenced the old orchard and the Correspondence fire. Innes noted that several elderly witnesses spoke of a soft humming from the ground, heard every spring, always beginning near the anniversary of the Price's disappearance. He included transcriptions of their remarks. "Sometimes it sounds like talking," one woman said, "like a man reading to someone half asleep." Innes's notes were later published in a university bulletin, though one passage was redacted by editors. The missing section, preserved in his drafts, described an unmarked envelope received at his dormitory shortly after he submitted the PAP. Inside was a pressed peach blossom and a message, "You're early." Innes left Oklahoma abruptly that summer, joining the military. He never returned. Years later, his widow donated his papers to the library. Among them was a sealed folder labeled, "Do not open until 1962." It remains unopened to this day, kept in the restricted archives of the university's history department. Meanwhile, small tremors continued to shake the old orchard ground, subtle enough to evade scientific interest, yet strong enough for locals to feel them through the soles of their shoes. Some residents believed the land was breathing out, preparing for the vow's end. In late autumn, a county worker replacing a signpost near the road struck something metallic beneath the soil. Expecting a pipe, he dug deeper and uncovered an old postal box, its brass plate tarnished but readable. The date etched on it was 1912. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded many times. It bore one line in elegant, deliberate script, "When 50 comes, we wake." The worker turned it in to the sheriff, who locked it in the evidence room. The next morning, both he and the box were gone. Only a faint smell of linseed oil lingered in the air, mixed with something sweet, like overripe peaches. By 1947, what little remained of the case was treated as rural superstition, a curiosity mentioned only in passing by journalists or late-night radio hosts searching for eerie material. Yet the people of Fairfax still knew not to linger along the road at dusk. That year, a traveling repairman named Julian Poe stopped in town, claiming he could fix the recurring power outages near the stretch where the orchard once grew. He worked for the Rural Electrification Service and prided himself on skepticism. "If there's a ghost," he joked to locals, "I'll wire it proper." He began his inspection at noon under a dry sky. By sunset, when his supervisor came looking, Poe's truck stood empty at the roadside, engine running, headlights pointed toward a patch of disturbed soil. His notebook lay open on the seat. The last page contained a single sentence written in shaky script. "The ground is whispering my name." His tools were found later near the old fence posts, each piece arranged neatly in pairs. 2 days afterward, the town's electric lines hummed with static that technicians couldn't explain. Some residents claimed the interference sounded like faint breathing. The phenomenon ceased after a week, leaving behind the lingering smell of smoke and wet paper. Around that same period, archivist Helen McCord, who had once handled the orchard photograph, returned to the county to review war casualty lists. She stayed at the same boarding house that had hosted Father Callahan years before. In her personal diary, she recorded waking each night at precisely 2:13 a.m. to the sound of writing. Soft, deliberate strokes, as if a pen moved just beyond the wall. On the 5th night, she traced the sound to her window. There, on the inside of the glass, she saw lines of reversed handwriting forming and fading within seconds. She copied what she could before it vanished. The message read, "Eleanor waits below." Terrified, she fled the next morning and left the county for good. Her diary survived, sealed in a library box, annotated by later historians who debated whether her handwriting matched the message she claimed appeared on the glass. In the years that followed, minor tremors continued to trouble Osage County, Oklahoma, though scientists dismissed them as shifting clay and old oil tunnels. Yet each tremor was said to coincide with rain, the scent of peaches, or a report of faint humming underfoot. In 1948, a meteorological team surveying storm patterns captured a barometric anomaly above Fairfax, a brief dip in air pressure precisely over the highway curve where the orchard once stood. The report included a photograph taken during the reading, the faint outline of two shapes visible on the wet pavement, darker than shadows and aligned perfectly hand in hand. No one noticed the figures until decades later, when the photograph was reprinted in a local history pamphlet. Those who looked closely said the shapes were transparent, yet detailed enough to reveal the edge of a high-collared dress and the brim of an old felt hat. The pamphlet was withdrawn from circulation a week later, after complaints from readers who claimed the image changed slightly each time they looked at it. Sometimes the figures were closer together, sometimes turned toward the viewer. By 1949, the Whitcomb case had faded almost completely from public record, preserved only in fragments and rumor. Still, there were those who couldn't let the story rest. One such man was Dr. Everett Lang, a young anthropologist from Tulsa, with an interest in what he called reciprocal mourning, the belief that love could tether the living and the dead through ritual. Lang arrived in Fairfax under the guise of collecting folktales, but soon became obsessed with the Prices. His field journal, later recovered by his assistant, detailed a quiet determination to locate the correspondence site. On the evening of August 2nd, he ventured alone toward the old highway. That night, townsfolk reported seeing the flash of a lantern moving steadily along the weeds, then stopping suddenly. He never returned. The next morning, the sheriff found Lang's lantern upright beside a shallow depression in the earth. At its center lay a single envelope sealed with wax, the same initials impressed into the stamp, EP. Inside was one sentence in dark, fresh ink. "You are the witness." Lang's body was discovered 3 days later, half a mile away in a dry creek bed. His expression was calm, his hands folded as though in prayer. The coroner noted faint traces of ink beneath his fingernails. His assistant later told reporters that Lang had once said he expected to hear them before seeing them. That remark, combined with the letter, revived local fascination with the case. People began stopping along the highway again, hoping to glimpse something, but few stayed long. One motorist described seeing two figures standing by the ditch, one holding what appeared to be a small box. "They weren't frightening," he said. "Just sad, like folks waiting for someone who's late." In September, a letter surfaced at the Tulsa archives addressed to the custodian of records. The postmark was smeared, but the return address read simply Orchard. The contents were brief. "All has been received. 50 years nearly kept. The archivist who opened it, a man named Alfred Crane, suffered a seizure moments later and died that evening. His colleagues sealed the letter in a vault that was later lost in a flood. That winter, a schoolteacher passing the site after nightfall claimed to see blossoms drifting across the air, though the trees were long gone. She described a sweet, dry scent and the sound of pages turning in the wind. She moved away soon after. By early 1950, the county paved over the last remnants of the orchard, laying new asphalt across the hollow ground. Construction workers complained that their machines stalled without reason. One, a man named Peter Knox, found his name scratched into the underside of a bulldozer blade the following morning, etched deeply, in handwriting identical to that found on the old correspondence letters. He quit the job immediately, saying, "Whatever's under there can keep it." When the road finally opened, it bore no marker, just a milepost number that locals quietly avoided mentioning. The soil beneath, compacted and sealed, was said to hum faintly after rain, though no one ever stopped to listen long enough to be certain. By the early spring of 1950, the story had retreated once again into silence. The new asphalt road gleamed under the pale light of dawn, erasing all trace of orchard and ruin. Drivers who passed that way said it felt as if the stretch itself listened, quiet, waiting, measuring the sound of each engine that dared cross it. That year marked 38 years since Eleanor and Edwin Price had first appeared in the records of Osage County, Oklahoma, and though the county's files had been purged, the legend refused to fade. Letters began to arrive at the local post office again, postmarked from nowhere traceable. Each was written in the same elegant hand and addressed to names of those long dead: McAllen, Brigham, Hale, even Dr. Leland. None contained more than a few words, phrases like, "The orchard blooms again," or "The vow holds." The postmaster burned them after hours, but admitted before retiring that the ink on his fingers would not wash off. Late that summer, a boy fishing near the bridge downstream noticed an odd shimmer under the water. He waded in and found a metal lockbox wedged beneath the stones. Inside were brittle sheets of paper, letters half dissolved, written in parallel lines of opposing handwriting, one heavy and deliberate, the other soft and looping. The only legible sentence read, "We are home." The boy told his father, who threw the box back into the river that night, fearing bad luck. 2 weeks later, the river flooded, cutting a new path through the bend and washing away the place entirely. From then on, storms struck the region with strange precision, forming low clouds that lingered above the same mile of highway. Farmers said their tools rusted faster there, and their wells filled with a faint sweetness, like fruit left too long on a branch. In 1951, a group of geology students conducted a test boring beneath that section of road. At 40 feet, they hit something unexpected: hollow space, then the sound of a faint echo, as if air moved below. They lowered a microphone into the borehole. What came through was not wind, but the slow, rhythmic scrape of pen on paper. The recording was sealed and archived, the equipment destroyed. One of the students, interviewed years later, described it quietly. It wasn't writing words, it was finishing them. By 1952, the road had earned a quiet nickname among locals, the Orchard Line. Truckers claimed their headlights dimmed there even on clear nights, and some said they saw two shapes standing by the guardrail, facing the wind. They never moved, never spoke, but one driver swore he saw the man raise his hand, as though offering a letter to anyone brave enough to stop. No one ever did. Today, nothing remains of the Whitcomb property. No markers, no graves, only a gentle rise in the land, where grass grows thicker and darker after every rain. Yet those who walk that road alone, especially near dusk, sometimes notice the faint scent of peaches and the soft crackle of static, as though some old current still flows beneath the earth, carrying with it a promise too deep for silence. They say, if you listen closely enough, you can hear the whisper of pen against paper, finishing the vow that began in 1912, still echoing beneath the soil of Oklahoma.